Okay, good morning everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Morning. So, any questions?
सर
Yes,
सर ये रिस्पॉन्स रिडक्शन फैक्टर ये टाइम पीरियड के साथ वेरी करना चाहिए
right.
बट बट आपने कहा था कि इन IS 1893 इसको कांस्टेंट अज्यूम किया है थ्रू आउट टाइम पीरियड आर को तो
That's
सर
right.
ऐसा व्हाई इज इट सो
Uh, why is it so? The reason is just convenience. Uh, you look at it, I mean, there are two things in which there are several formulations actually. If you read, are you following A.K. Chopra's book for theory of vibration?
ये सर समटाइम्स
Okay, so he has a very interesting discussion, very elaborate discussion on this particular thing, R mu T, uh, relationship of response reduction factor that we call as R with respect to ductility demand, I mean the element displacement ductility and the natural period of the oscillator, right? So you may like to have a look at it and you will understand the issues are really very involved and there is no simple factor. I cannot have tabulated values for which you need to every time you need to consult the table and pick up appropriate value of R and then use it, right? So either I provide you a function form which you can use as a function of ductility, or I provide you a simple constant, something simpler to use which will be understood by everyone and it would be implemented correctly by everyone, right?
ओके
So and if you look at it, it's really doesn't make uh, it's a very small price to pay in the trade-off. If I look at the simplicity and the reliability or confidence that people will be using it correctly, rather than prescribing something very elaborate which is theoretically correct but it is so confusing that most of the time its implementation will be faulty, right?
ओके
So it would be correct in principle but wrong in implementation. So on the contrary, we adopt for which is approximate in principle but correct in implementation always. So that's how all design codes, not just a seismic design code, any structural design code, they are essentially developed with a view to reduce or minimize any scope of confusion or ambiguity. People should be able to use it very easily and without any confusion, without creating any more confusion.
ओके सर यस
Right? So typically we have two kinds of behavior. Uh, we call it, although the term is equal displacement, it's often called as rule or principle, although it's neither. It is an approximation, right? It's an approximation. So any use of this term, rule or principle, is not really warranted. And second one is equal energy. Again, principle. So this type of behavior it is actually dependent on the natural period. So this is for short period, and this is for long period range, right? So this means for this R is equal to just mu and for this range R is equal to square root of twice mu minus 1. This is arrived at from equating the area under the curve, load displacement curve. So this is displacement, this is load. For an elastic system you have area under this curve, this entire area, and for an elastoplastic system this is the ultimate displacement, and this is probably what you would call as U collapse ultimate, and this is yield displacement, and ratio of this ultimate by yield displacement is what you call as ductility, right? So if you equate the area under these two curves, you will get this range that response reduction factor should be, forces should be, I mean the idea is by what amount should I bring down the force. This is the elastic force if the system was resisting the force completely elastically, and if I allow a ductility of mu, then what is the force level that I can bring it down such that the energy dissipation or energy storage is same. So if you impose this, then you will get this kind of relationship. But what happens is when you have a long period system, that is stiffness is very very small, I mean it's a flexible system, then it is almost like a very flexible system, it is like this, right? So in case of flexible system, the elastic displacement elastic system is approximately equal to the displacement of elastoplastic system. Right? So when this happens, when the elastic displacement is equal to ultimate displacement for plastic system, then obviously it is response reduction factor is same as the ductility factor, and that is mu. So this is the next level of rigor that, if you would call it, that you can have in response reduction factor, and this is probably the oldest one, although there are many more complicated relationships based on numerical studies about how these what is the effect of ductility and natural period on the seismic response and ultimate response vis-a-vis elastic response of the system, and you can have a look at it, and more or less you can compare how does this response reduction or ratio of elastic response versus plastic response changes with respect to time, right? So you will find that although it does vary, but assuming a constant force, constant value of R is not really that much of an issue. For example, if R is equal to, let's say mu is equal to 5, so what is square root twice mu minus 1? This is equal to 10 minus 1, 9, so this is equal to 3. So a ratio, I mean, whether you are taking it response down by factor of 5 or by a factor of 3 is not really that much of a variation if you look at it, right? So for larger ductilities, for example, if the mu is 10, then this becomes square root of 19. So what is it?
4.36.
4.36, right? So so the point is, for limited ductility that we have in a structural system, this ratio is not really that much sensitive. But if you have very large value of ductility mu, then it is of course going to make a large difference. But we do not have this kind of very large values of mu to play around with, right? For the structural systems, particularly for reinforced concrete and masonry buildings, masonry system, we do not have very large mu at our disposal, so it's not really that much of an issue, right?
Yes, sir.
So any questions? Any more questions? Now about that, okay, so this plastic analysis, all of you, almost all of you, I did not go through all the submissions. Almost all of you, whatever I have seen, you have used portal mechanism, right? So and then a combined mechanism. Where you have hinge at the bottom and then a hinge here and a hinge here under the load. Either way, either hinge at this end or at this end and one hinge at the bottom. So this is what you have, all of you have used. Anybody who has done something different?
Yes, sir. Beam mechanism.
Okay, beam mechanism is fine. So other than that, beam mechanism, of course, you would find that collapse load is much larger, so that doesn't govern. Right, another one that you call as so this is beam mechanism. What you forget or you are still not tuned to earthquake engineering, is that this lateral load is actually reversible. So if there is a hinge developing here, then it is equally probable that there will be a hinge developing at this end, and that is what we prefer. Hinge at the midspan is going to cause excessive deformation, deflection in this beam. That is something that we do not want to allow, right? It would be much better if I have this, instead of developing plastic hinge at this point, if I develop a plastic hinge at this point, right? Then the system would be, instead of fixed beam, you will have hinged beam at the two ends, right? So this is again not preferred. I would rather look for a mechanism like this. So there will be a mechanism, plastic hinge at the base. I cannot avoid that, and there would be moment. I can call it either 0.1, either way. Now keep this in mind that we need these two plastic hinges for a collapse mechanism, for a mechanism. One hinge renders this statically indeterminate system into not one hinge, these three hinges, two hinges at the column base and one hinge at the beam end, that will render it statically determinate, and then one more hinge is required to render it into a collapse mechanism, right? Now these two hinges, total 4 hinges are required for releasing the adequate number of constraints. So these hinges can be anywhere, but I would rather, there is another possible location that it can be somewhere here in the columns, or it can be somewhere here, right? So these are what I say possible, okay, I should just say possible locations for plastic hinges. So this is also possible location for developing plastic hinges. Now what happens? What is the difference? What if the what is so great about developing hinges here and not allowing hinges to develop in this at these columns? I will try to show this. You see this? Are you able to see this skeleton?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so let me focus the camera towards this. So this is a toy system that I built, and these are the possible hinge locations. These are the columns, possible hinge locations. If I tighten these screws very rigidly, then this becomes like a very strong connection. So plastic moment capacities would be very large. And similarly, these are the, I make this very tight, so this models, these ends simulate the rigid connections. moment resistant connections. So first let me show you what happens when I have the moment capacity of the columns smaller than the moment capacity of the beams. Right, so I just nominally restrain these, and I will put this okay. So this is fine. This is very beams are much stronger than the moment capacity of beams is much stronger than the moment capacity of columns, and in this situation if I then obviously this is a collapse mechanism, portal mechanism, as you can see, right? Under the influence of lateral loads, this will sway, and this is what is now what is the problem with this developing this portal mechanism? That any load, of course it has to withstand the gravity load also in addition to lateral load. So in addition to gravity, when it is subjected after developing these plastic hinges at the column, developing into a portal mechanism, this gravity load, under the influence of gravity load, this will simply collapse. It is simply unable to take any gravity load afterwards. On the other hand, if I allow columns to be stronger, let me just reverse the situation in which the columns are really very strong. And let me loosen up the beams a little bit. Okay. So now so this is strong column and weak beam. I have loosened up, reduced the moment capacity of this beam hinges. So now under the influence of lateral load, hinges form here, and this is how it is going to deform. So a rigid link, so this is this geometry is maintained, rigid connection is maintained, hinges form at a distance, some distance away from the column beam interface, column face, hinges form some distance away from the column face, and then this begins to rotate, and this is how it will happen in reversible action. Now what happens is, interesting thing is, after this has developed into a mechanism, it still continues to take the vertical load. It doesn't collapse like in the case of portal mechanism, right? It will continue to resist the vertical load. The vertical load carrying capacity is not severely compromised. Of course, under the influence of horizontal load, it will still sway, deform to a great extent. Lateral deformation sways would be large, but this system will not collapse. The entire thing will not come crumbling down, right? And that is the importance. That is what we call as the capacity design principle. This is the fundamental of capacity design principle. The capacity of the beam sections have to be kept smaller than the capacity of the column sections, and even in the beams, capacity of the shear, I mean the margin of safety against shear has to be much higher than the margin of safety against flexure. I mean, we should never allow this to happen, this to fail in shear. This bending is fine, it only develops a hinge. If it had to fail in shear, the entire thing will collapse, right? So bending, deformation, plastic hinge development in bending is perfectly fine. The structure doesn't lose its integrity, whereas if the plastic hinges were to develop in columns, the entire structure would lose its integrity and come crushing down. So that's the basic principle of capacity design, and strong column, weak beam concept comes from here. Now the problem is, it is very good to talk of this and think of and be happy that I have designed a strong column and weak beam system, but in practice you may end up doing something very different. So in practice you may end up doing something very different in the sense that although you have designed in your design calculations, you have provided for lower capacity, section capacity, flexural capacity for the beams, and marginally higher section capacities for the columns, but it may still turn out that your beams are stronger than columns. How is that going to happen? Any situation that you can think of?
Sir, maybe the slab is acting as a T-beam that may increase the capacity of beam.
Yeah, you design it as a T-beam. If the slab is monolithic, then obviously you design the beam as a T-beam. So that capacity is already incorporated. Right? So that is not the reason. The reason is in the definition of what is the yield strength. What is the Fy that you take, FCK, for the reinforcing steel? Do you know remember the definition? If you refer to the IS code for reinforcing steel bars, it says that the number that you are getting here, that you are using as a yield strength of steel, that actually refers to, it is actually defined as minimum guaranteed steel. It is not actually certified that the yield strength that you are using, that number Fy 415 or FE 500, that 500 MPa is the yield strength. That's not true. That 500 actually refers to that yield strength will not be less than 500. That is the minimum guaranteed yield. So actual yield strength can be anything. The steel manufacturers do not quantify that what is the actual steel's yield strength, right? So when you design your member, considering it to be under reinforced, very carefully proportioning the section and area and balancing it, and then deciding it that the section has to be under reinforced, it may actually not be under reinforced at all, because you do not know what is the true yield. And this problem will be more acute if the reinforcement in beams is from a different batch from the reinforcement that is used in column caging. So then you don't even have the uniformity of the metallurgy. You do not even know that if yields steel of that is used in beam corresponds to a higher yield point, then doesn't matter. Steel in the columns is also from the same batch, so it will also correspond to the same yield point. But if they come from a different batch, then obviously you do not have any that assurance, any such kind of assurance, right? And then although you in your calculations your beams turn out to be, or your beams look as if they are designed to be weak beams, in actual construction at site what you have produced, it might actually turn out to be a stronger beam which is stronger than the columns. So that is something that has to be taken care of as far as possible. The reinforcement that is used in the beam column junction, both in beams and and columns, they should be from the same lot, although it is very, very difficult to ensure and adhere in practice. So what is done is you account for overstrength when you are deciding the column capacity of the column. You assume that there is an inherent element of overstrength in the beams, right? And then you decide columns on the basis of overstrength capacity of beams. You design it for something, then you multiply it by a factor for accounting for overstrengths. So typically it is about 25% higher. You assume that beam capacities are 25% higher, and then accordingly you design the column sections such that columns capacities are higher than what you would obtain, the moments and shears that you will obtain in columns, assuming that the beam capacities are 25% higher than what you have actually calculated and designed for, to account for the overstrength in the system. Only when you do this, you have a chance of adhering to the basic concepts of capacity design approach, that beam capacities have to be exceeded first, then the forces resort to exhausting column capacities for plastic deformations. Right? So any questions about this?
Sir,
Yes.
as you said, sir, because of this reinforcement, the capacity will maybe high. But sir, it can, like column can also follow the same thing, no, sir?
Column can also.
Follow the same thing. Like we are assuming that column is of higher capacity than beam, and it may have more than that higher capacity.
Yes.
So why is need of this overstrength? Because column can also be at a higher side there.
So if column is higher, then nothing wrong with it. We want columns to be stronger than beams. But we do not want to, or we cannot afford to take a chance by when our basic assumptions in design to be invalidated. You design a system assuming that beam is weaker than the column, but in practice it may turn out that because of these uncertainties, you do not really know what is the true yield point of the reinforcing steel. It may be much higher than what you have assumed in your calculation. So beams capacities may be much larger than the column capacities actually. And if that happens, that is going to be disastrous. We don't ever want to happen that to happen. If the column is stronger, equally stronger, there is no harm in making it a little more stronger, right? But the reverse should never happen. Beams should never be stronger than columns.
We are going for proportionality.
Pardon?
That means we are going for extra factors, like we can say.
Yes, we are going for extra. I mean, that's what. It's not factor of safety. We are going for what I have been emphasizing again and again: preferred mode of damage. I want to ensure a particular mode of damage. I want to, if it has to incur any inelastic deformation, then I want to ensure that these inelastic deformations would happen in this particular manner only. No other form of inelastic deformation is allowed in the system. So if plastic hinges have to form, they have to form in beams and only at these locations. They cannot form at any arbitrary position, right? And they should definitely not form in the columns. Column sway mechanism or portal mechanism, we just do not allow it to develop. And the only way to ensure that is to guarantee in the middle of all these uncertainties about the structural properties that beam capacities would never exceed column capacities. If as a consequence I have to increase column capacities to by a certain margin more than what is required, that's a fair trade-off. That the life safety, the safety, the improvement in the structural performance during strong earthquakes for this small cost is much more than compensated. Right, so it's always the beams have to be beam capacities have to be smaller than the column capacities in every possible occurrence, any possible situation, any possible combination of conditions or situations. And that is why when we calculate the beam capacities, we increase those beam capacities by using overstrength factor. And then for those overstrength accounted for beam capacities, then you figure out what should be the bending moments and shear force capacities for the column sections, right? And that is why it is implemented in a different way, simple ways, and that is why you have this kind of relationship that it has to be moment capacities of the column has to be more than 20% of the column 20% higher than the moment capacities of the beam, right? So that's what I had informed earlier, if you recall, in the last lecture. Beta factor I had kept as 1.2. That's a normal practice in design. You would you would allow for column capacities to be 20%, about 20% higher than the beam capacities. Okay? Okay, so coming back to our, what is happening? Yes. So capacity design. Strong columns and weak beams. Higher margin of safety against shear then flexure, right? So strong columns, weak beams, column capacities are kept higher than that predicted by analysis. Now, how much higher is higher enough? I told you that is MC. So MC is usually kept as 1.2 times beam capacities. So that 0.2 is that 20% increase is roughly to account for the overstrength of the system, overstrength of the beam section, so that we guarantee that column capacities will, or try to guarantee, we can never guarantee 100%, but we try to minimize the chances that column capacities will be exceeded before the beam capacities. Beams develop plastic hinges. So that's about it about the capacity design. Now it's down to the basic calculations of design calculations and analysis to compute the forces, find out what is the stress resultants, and carry on with the design. The basic material, you are all familiar with reinforced concrete and steel, so design principles remain the same. It's just a matter of combining earthquake effects, forces due to earthquake effects, with the forces forces that are developed in the body members, structural members, in the case of gravity load, dead load and imposed loads or live loads, and combine appropriately the dead load, imposed load, live load and the earthquake load or wind load, and account for carry on with your design calculations. So that's about it. So next couple of lectures we will be spending on the analysis. Again, I will try to run through this process, because most of it you will be studying in theory of vibration as well. So what is going on in theory of vibration?
Pulse loading, sir.
Okay, so still single degree of freedom system, is that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, so that's what I thought. So I will have to rush through the concept of multi-degree freedom system and the analysis for multi-degree freedom system. How do we do that? for seismic analysis, and how do we compute the, I mean, we talked about the design spectrum, development of design spectrum, but then proof of the pudding is in eating. So how do we use that design spectrum? It has to be used for our design calculation. So how do we make use of that design spectrum in our design calculations, and how do we actually compute the forces for which we need to design our sections, right? So that is what we'll be discussing in our next couple of lectures. First we will start with the basic modeling assumptions. Dynamic analysis is something, I mean, it is impossible or very difficult, if not impossible, to do without recourse to computers. And as I keep saying, computers are the basic tools. You should be able to use it efficiently, proficiently. It is as fundamental tool as for an engineer these days as a lathe machine or just any other tool in your workshop, right? So learn to use computers. So we will start using some concepts, I mean some modeling assumptions and development of the or solution of the equations for dynamic analysis. So how do we perform a dynamic analysis? Seismic analysis of single degree of freedom system. We have already discussed about response spectrum. So now we are talking about multi-degree of freedom systems. What is a degree of freedom, by the way? What is a degree of freedom? Or more precisely, dynamic degree of freedom. I am sure you are familiar with kinematic degrees of freedom. Yes? Any ideas? Kinematic degrees of freedom or dynamic degrees of freedom? Whatever you can think of. This is not a quiz.
But free to moving, how many ways free to move is dynamic degree of freedom?
Okay, so kinematic degrees of freedom is the independent, I mean what I would rather say, all degrees of freedom that we refer to, they are independent mechanisms by which a system can deform. Kinematic degrees of freedom I am talking, right? So if you need to track the motion, then you need to specify the motion of these independent components, and you should be able to, by specification of these independent components, you would be able to uniquely define the motion of any system or any particle that you are trying to characterize or monitor, right? So And of course, you can actually have more degrees of freedom. I mean, you can decide to have monitor more points, and you can have a higher number of coordinates, but not all of them are independent. Some of them could be derived coordinates, and so degrees of freedom, I'll refer to them as a independent parameters that are needed to define the motion of a point or a system in space, right? So dynamic degrees of freedom are essentially the coordinates that I need, minimum number of coordinates, specification of coordinates that I need to define the motion of inertia points, right? So inertia is the fundamental principle of dynamics, right? There cannot be any dynamics without inertia. So I need to keep track of inertia points. There can be translation inertia, there can be rotary inertia, whatever, depending on the system, how I am modeling the system. So I need to keep track of this inertia points, because that is what is going to generate momentum, which will help me, or which I have to use. I need to know the momentum before I can figure out what is the rate of change of momentum to develop the equation of motion, which will allow me to find the dynamic effects, right? So I need to figure out how many degrees of freedom I need to uniquely define the motion of inertia points, and that is what is referred to as dynamic degrees of freedom. And I keep track, once I do that, I keep track of these dynamic degrees of freedom, and they may be smaller than kinematic degrees of freedom. If the inertia component is very small, then I may choose to ignore it, and then dynamic degrees of freedom may be smaller than kinematic degrees of freedom in some cases. So we have been talking about single story building model. So let us now increase the complexity by 1 degree. So this is a simple portal. So how many degrees of freedom does it have? If I model it as using a beam column elements, right? This can be modeled as a skeletal system. I mean, matrix methods you have already done. So I can model it as a node 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. 6 nodes, 1 element, 2 element, 3 element, third element, fourth element, fifth element and sixth element, right? So let's say one particular element, let's say element number 1, so there would be 3 degrees of freedom at each node if I am doing a plane frame analysis, right? So I, J and this is element E. Okay, it's difficult to visualize in vertical direction, so let me make things easier for you and for me as well. Any element E is defined by 2 nodes I and J. So Uj, Vj theta j, ui, vi, theta I. So these are the degrees of freedom, and element can have its own properties, Young's modulus, length, and area of cross section, polar moment of inertia, and so on. So you can develop the equations for this. So what is total degrees of freedom? Okay, it's 11 already, so I will stop here. We will resume in the afternoon, but keep thinking about it.